I'll talk about this topic that they've introduced, cybersecurity experimentation of the future, and I'll start by discussing why do we need to talk about this? What's wrong with the way we experiment today, and why does it matter? So to start looking at the statistics of attacks over the last 3 years, we've seen this huge increase in strength and frequency of attacks. We've seen many privacy leaks and blunders and oversteps by technical companies that could have been prevented with better design. We've also seen large, impactful attacks on our infrastructure. One example is wide-reaching supply chain attack on government infrastructure that was SolarWinds attack. We also probably all remember attack on Colonial Pipeline, which was ransomware, and which impacted service in the eastern United States. The last 3 years also saw largest cumulative DDoS attack to date, which lasted 36 hours and generated total of almost 3 petabytes of traffic. And so if we ask ourselves why we are seeing this constant increase, and especially over the last 3 years, this really exponential increase in the strength and frequency of attacks, we'll realize that we have really relied on the internet more and more over the time. And since last 3 years were COVID pandemic, everything was online. So we did our entertainment and daily interactions online, work was online, critical infrastructure moved online, government businesses all, were moving online even before pandemic. And so attacks are very impactful nowadays because they can disturb us. Attackers understand that there is a large impact involved when they launch an attack, and they can expect then people to pay, for example, for ransomware in order to stop the attack, or pay to stop denial of service attack. So since attacks are increasing and becoming more impactful, it is really important for us to step up the cybersecurity and privacy research and to bring it from, mostly academic endeavor to something that can become, products that we use in our daily lives and that can really secure our infrastructure, secure our online interactions. And for that, we need reproducible experimentation because it's really hard to do research if you're always starting from scratch. It's much easier if you are able to start when previous researchers left off and build on their ideas, but also build on their evaluation and be able to show that your solution is better than theirs in some respect. And so this reproducible experimentation can be viewed as a foundation for better cybersecurity and privacy research. So if you look at today's research landscape and you read through the papers that are published in top conferences, you'll find that our research is still opportunistic, meaning the research group that publishes at the conference does research on some small version of a bigger problem that is simplified, and it's usually isolated from the rest of the world. For example, let's say that you're doing research on data exfiltration. You will make some assumption about the network where this exfiltration may occur, and some assumption about users of that network and their use patterns and what information is exchanged. And any assumption that you make will be quite simplistic compared to what is in the real world. Also, research groups have special hardware or private data sets, and this gives them opportunity to do certain types of research, but that research, unfortunately, cannot be reproduced by others. We also find a lot of work in isolation from related work, meaning that when people publish, they cannot really compare quantitatively their results with results from related work. In many cases, because the related work did not release their code or their data. And so the comparison ends up being qualitative, and this is not good. We cannot really tell who's better, who's worse. We can tell that they are different, but it's hard to compare. It's hard to measure progress. In the meantime, attackers are not facing these difficulties. They are collaborating. We are seeing very rich underground market in, where people sell their attack code or sell compromised machines or sell, services that would help in launching certain kinds of attacks. And therefore, attacks are also getting more sophisticated and coordinated and stronger and more frequent. So we really need to work to catch up with the attacks and hopefully even surpass them and be able to prevent some attacks instead of always reacting to that. So how can we do that? If you look at the blue highlighted items, working on small compartmentalized simplified problems and working in isolation from related work, this tells us that we really need collaborative research. And maybe this collaboration doesn't have to be direct. Maybe it's not, several research groups working together on the same problem, but rather building on each other's work. So these groups are still competitive. They still can publish independently. They can, come up with their own intellectual property. But at the same time, if they are releasing their coded data and doing their experimentation in a way that is reproducible by others, they can build on each other's work. And we can have this vertical research progress that really can lead to complex and sophisticated solutions as opposed to solutions that are, really interesting and cool, but they apply only to a small version of the problem. However, to get there, we need to overcome these obstacles that are highlighted in yellow that lead to lower reproducibility, which are working with private data sets and experimenting using resources in one's own lab. And so I'll elaborate on that with some numbers. Recently, I surveyed about 700 papers from top 4 cybersecurity conferences in 2022. And specifically, I was looking at the experimentation part. Were there any experimentation done in the paper? How was it done? Where the resources came from? And you can see that a vast amount of papers, around 95%, have some experiment. The rest are theoretical and they don't really have to measure anything. There is no performance measurement in the paper. But the rest are doing some kind of experimentation. And then if you break it down into what resources are being used and what kind of experimentation, you can see that some papers are doing measurement, which means interacting with live users or servers in live internet. Some are doing user surveys, human user studies. Some are doing data set analysis of an existing data set, either private or public, but mostly private. Some are using machines in cloud to do experimentation. These are usually approaches that look at distributed systems like blockchain. A vast number is using resources from their own institution, either their own lab or even sometimes their own laptop. And this is between 38 and 71% of papers. Some are doing binary analysis, which can also be done on either cloud machine or in their own lab or on a test bed. But I put it as a separate category because to do binary analysis properly, you need to use certain tools. You need to calibrate them really well. You need to understand how to calibrate them to get best results. And so it's the software part, not the hardware part, that makes it hard to reproduce unless you've really specified well in the paper or released the artifact how you did your measurements. Some number of papers uses special hardware. This could be, for example, IoT or other, vehicular security, for example, they have access to hardware that is in vehicles. And so that also is an obstacle to reproduction by others. Some are using simulators, and minuscule numbers last year, at least in those top 4 security conferences, used the public testbed. And if you ask yourself, what amount of this research could have been done by using just general compute nodes that exist in any testbed, the numbers are shown here at the bottom. And I'll tell you, this is about 35 to 40% of experimentation that could be done just by taking what is already done by researchers and moving it to the public testbed. You can see that many of these rows are marked irreproducible because the research is done on hardware or with software that is hard for others to access, or with data and methodology that is hard for others to understand unless it's described in great detail. This is the case for measurement and survey. So overall, what's missing is that most research is irreproducible because it's done on their own, on the researchers' own computers, or even if it's done on clouds, it might be reproducible because you can reserve the same machines in the cloud, but it may be costly. Whereas if you were to move these approaches to public testbeds, then you could have reproducible research for free because public testbeds are usually free to use. And that would support around 35% of experiments today. The other problem with reproducibility that I'll talk a little later about is that there are some research artifacts that are released, still not a lot, but we are seeing more cybersecurity researchers release their code, release their data to enable reproduction. But there are certain problems with ability to find these artifacts, with the quality of the artifacts in the packaging. And so the question is, how can we do better in the future? Because if we could improve reproducibility, this would increase sophistication of the research we can do and enable researchers to build on each other's work and to compare properly with each other's work. But to improve reproducibility, we need better research infrastructure, and we need better and more research artifacts that are easier to reuse. So this will be the main topics of my talk. How can we get to this better research infrastructure? What is needed, and how can we get better and more research artifacts? Before I continue, I wanted to offer you an opportunity to take a quick survey. The survey is linked here, and I'll pause for 5 minutes to let you, it's only 2 multiple choice questions. I'll pause to let you take the survey, and then we'll look at the results. The questions are about the way you experiment today. This survey has mimicked one activity that we've done in the workshop that we ran in this December 2022. And I'll tell you more about this workshop in a minute. Before I go on, I want to introduce, this is the like an outline of the talk, or the hypothesis of the talk, that for sophisticated research products, we need more research that is vertical in nature. And to get there, we need to be able to do better experimentation. This is, I use the term representative experimentation. However, in the workshop, many people use the term realistic experimentation. So some experimentation that is more sophisticated, more similar to what one might find in the real world, less of a toy experimentation. And we also need reproducibility, for which we need people to share artifacts that are good enough quality so they can be easily reused. And in both cases, for experimentation and for artifacts, we want them to be easy to use. So I'll keep these figures throughout my slides, and I'll indicate by using the circle the portion that I'm covering at the moment. So we'll cover the left portion, which is better experimentation. There were a series of workshops called Cybersecurity Experimentation of the Future that were ran between 2014 and 2018. And a very wide community of researchers and industry, and in some cases even government officials were asked to give input about what's important for the future of cybersecurity experimentation. And you can see the main 8 findings listed on this slide. What people thought would be important is to support multidisciplinary experimentation that was also representative of the domain that is being researched. Model the real world, including the human activity. And then there were some findings about the features that the experimentation environment should have, such as open interfaces for accessibility, ability to interconnect different research infrastructure so that you can pool resources and have experiments spanning different test beds. And then also what support should this research infrastructure provide to the user. One kind of support that is not provided today is to help with the experiment design, to produce reusable designs for science-based hypothesis testing so that you can change some parameters and go through the space of possible design cases and explore in your research. And to support the experiment execution and management, many testbeds today just give you resources and then it's up to the user to see what they want to do with them. To support instrumentation and experiment analysis. And then there was this finding about improving usability and changing culture in the community itself. So this is a great list, but we had a question about, did it change over time? Because it's been a number of years since 2018. And we also wanted to come up with maybe more specific, more compact list of items that need to be improved. These are 8 items, and it's quite it's quite hard to see what are specific actionable recommendations that one could do and who should do them. So we decided to run another workshop in December 2022 to update these requirements. This was a virtual workshop organized by USC ISI. And we also ran another workshop on artifacts, on research artifacts and how they are shared, how they are reused, what is missing. That was ran in September 2022 by USC ISI, University of Utah, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and SRI. And so report first on findings of CEF 2022 workshop. We had 30 participants from various cybersecurity and privacy research domains. Some of these also had experience in building research infrastructure, building test beds. We also had a survey that we circulated to about 500 researchers using email. These were cybersecurity researchers that published recently in a top security conference, and we received 58 responses. And so we compiled all these responses to come up with findings of the workshop. Main questions we had were, what are experimentation needs in the community? Specifically, we asked people, what are your experimentation needs? And then extrapolated from that. What can testbeds do to meet those needs? And we also had a question about artifact sharing and reuse. How can testbeds help there, or what is missing, and what does the community need to do? You can see at the bottom the link to the report from this workshop. So first set of findings were around needs. A lot of people wanted common data sets and evaluation environments. And the need for this arises because people try to publish, they design their environment, they design their experiments, they run them, they try to publish, and reviewers come back saying this is a toy experiment. And the authors are then faced with, either the need to argue with the reviewers, which never works, or to they can make their experimentation more complex, more realistic, but it takes a lot of time. It's a big effort by one researcher to invest in that. And so ultimately, experimentation that is not representative makes it hard to publish. It would be great if we had these environments and data sets that are common in the community, and this would have to be very research domain dependent. So if you're doing, let's say, research on application level DDoS, there would be some evaluation environment and data set that others in your community and you could build together and agree that this is a good way to evaluate this type of research. And this would enable everyone to work in the same settings so they don't have to reinvent the world from scratch. The other big need was around modeling or including human users in experiments so that people could experiment with human factors together with technology. The other set of findings was around testbeds and what could testbeds do to help improve the experimentation. The first finding was really the same as with the needs. People wanted representative experimentation environments, but they also wanted a way for testbeds to amortize setup by helping reuse packaged experiments. So pretty much they wanted people to share their artifacts, their experiments on testbeds so that someone else could then reuse this experiment, because a lot of effort and a lot of time goes into building a representative experiment. And then you publish a paper and then you kind of move on from that type of research because you need to do something novel. But someone else that wants to reproduce your research and build on top of it would benefit from this packaged experiments that they could just reuse. They wanted user-friendly interfaces. Today, interfaces are kind of built for intermediate to sophisticated user, and novice users struggle. So these interfaces need to be easy to learn and use, but also sophisticated users need something that they can program so they can automate experimentation. When we are talking here, possibly not just about one interface, but a set of interfaces to cater for different types of users. The testbeds also needed ability to include third-party devices. This need came from the fact that no testbed can have all the hardware everyone needs. So there will always be some hardware that is present in the testbed and other hardware that is not there, but you really want to do research on. And maybe you want to do experiments that combine what's in the testbed and what's in your lab. Testbeds should support this mode of research. The other need was around variety of experimentation modes. So someone might want to do simulation. Other people may want to do emulation using virtual machines. Other people may want to do some experiment that is in the testbed, but it's also accessible from the outside and includes human users. And it was very hard to find testbeds that support all of this. The testbeds would usually support one or very few of these modes of experimentation. And then the last requirement was to expose testbed limitations to users. So testbeds usually have some assumptions and biases based on how they are built, and that those biases can propagate into research results. And it's really hard for researchers to know that unless it's really exposed and clearly stated somewhere in the testbed documentation. So they might spend time building their experiment only in the end to understand that it won't work on a given testbed. I will not talk much about artifacts because I will cover that later when I talk about the artifact workshop. I will just point some findings that were very specific to testbeds. And this finding is bolded here on this slide. It's about research infrastructure helping researchers package their artifacts. And the need for that comes from what we've observed, how users interact, for example, with the TerLab testbed, which we have at USC ISI. And we've also observed in the past when artifacts are released, Sometimes they are incomplete. Sometimes they have hard-coded data. Sometimes they are not portable, or they have missing pieces. And the reason for that is not really so much, researcher negligence or unwillingness to share. The research is really that the problem is that experimentation happens over months sometimes of researchers' life, and then you try to publish, and then you might be rejected. You revise, you try to publish again. Eventually, by the time you publish and you want to package the code or package data, it's been a while since you did this experimentation. So you might forget what you actually did, which files you used, how you set up your environment. So we really need testbeds to help address this cognitive burden on the researcher, to help them identify what needs to be packaged and to package efficiently. So to summarize our findings, what the workshop found is that we need community resources, representative environments, and data sets that are hosted on testbeds, which are easy to use and extensible. And those testbeds should have diverse hardware to support diverse experiments, ability to include humans in experiments, support various experiment modes, and offer some help to researchers for packaging and sharing of artifacts. So if you look at these findings, they roughly map to and validate the findings from the earlier CEF workshops, except that they are maybe more actionable and easier to understand, that, how to group them into a few sets of actionable items that, some could be done by communities, some could be done by funders, some could be done by the researchers. I'm going to ask you again, I guess, to do this quick survey. This is about artifacts, because we will segue into talking more about artifacts in the next half of the talk. So I'll wait a few minutes, because you guys were very fast last time, so maybe 3 minutes is enough. So maybe while you're filling out this second survey, we can look at the results of the first survey. So how do you experiment today? You can see that majority of responses was in this column of using equipment in your lab or a private test bed. So this means that again, this type of research leads to a reproducible results. And then if we look at what would improve experimentation experience, the largest number of responses was in this column, having representative, realistic environments and shared data sets that are used by everyone in the field. So that would have the biggest impact. The next one is rich representative data sets. And the next one is ability to easily design, automate, run, and analyze experiments. So pretty much the responses we're getting here resemble those that we were getting from the workshop.
Yeah, it's interesting to note that each of them got quite a few responses. And it's such a small set, you can't really say what's a clear winner, but they all had support.
Yeah, and it is a small set of responders too. But again, I would encourage people to read the report, because it's very informative and it's on a bigger set of responders. And it has very interesting findings that came from this community input. So go on and talk about artifacts workshop and their findings through that workshop, and then we'll look at our results from these questions that I posed. So the artifacts workshop was ran again at virtually. It had 32 participants from 18 organizations, and some of these were also chairing artifact evaluation committees, so they could speak from that role too. And we also had a survey that we circulated. This time we sent it to various mailing lists, and we got 31 responses. And I'm reporting on both of these communities' input together. So the main questions we had were around challenges around artifact sharing and reuse, and we broke this down into several aspects of artifact sharing and reuse. One was findability, how easy it is to find an artifact that you're looking for. Next was scope. Sometimes we think of artifacts as just data sets or data sets and code, but there is more to it. So we wanted to understand how, what's missing there, and how we can improve sharing on these other aspects of experimentation. We wanted to learn about quality and usability of artifacts, how evaluation is done today and what are benefits and what can be improved, and also what can community do, what are the next actionable steps that we can take. And so if we look at the findings around findability of artifacts, we'll see that there are many ways people share artifacts today. They might share them as web page in their lab or personal web page. They might share code on GitHub. They might share dataset or code on Zenodo. And this ultimately leads to difficulty in finding these artifacts and understanding the relationship between artifacts. Maybe understanding, if there's a paper, is there an accompanying artifact and how to find it? Or if there's an artifact, is there a paper that tells you more about how it was produced? So catalogs would help here. And myself, Dave, Laura, Terry Benzel, several other folks worked on this research, worked on the project to build a catalog for cybersecurity artifacts. You can see the link here, hubcyberexperimentation.org. That portal has a lot of artifacts that we have incorporated from prior cybersecurity conferences and other ways that where the cybersecurity artifacts were shared. But any catalog would require a critical mass of users and a critical mass of artifacts to be useful, because if you have a catalog that is sparsely populated or sparsely used, then it's really not making a big impact. The other problem is that when one finds an artifact, it's difficult to estimate how useful it is. And researchers really care about that. They don't want to spend time. Let's say they found 10 data sets that contain phishing. They want to understand how good these are without spending time to actually use them in research and painstakingly go through those artifacts to understand if they are representative, if they are, rich enough, if they are recent enough, and so on. So the one aspect here that would help is if researchers could rate artifacts, and they actually can in our portal. We would like to build some signal to the potential user that tells it this artifact is useful. It was, 5 researchers already voted that it is useful for this type of research. And the other aspect is if the artifact is maintained or not, because if it's relatively old and not maintained, and let's say it's code, then there are very low chances that it's going to be easy to use and easy to install and run. Scope was another aspect that we wanted to gather input on. So artifacts today mostly are thought about as code and data. But there is also much more when you do experimentation. There is research hypothesis, there are research methods that you employ to design the experiment. There are pre-processing and post-processing workflows. And this is usually not very well shared. It's not shared as an artifact, and it's usually not very well described in papers, because sometimes it's actually harmful for the author to put a lot of details in the paper, because reviewers then pick on these details and your paper might get rejected. But these aspects of experimentation are very important for someone who is trying to reproduce an experiment, because they might not be able to reproduce it and get the exact results, even if they have the exact code and data that the authors of some paper used, because these pieces are missing: the research methods, the design, the pre-processing and post-processing, and so on. And also the experimentation environment can introduce biases that are not known to authors. This was the reason why testbeds could help here by exposing their limitations and biases. The next question was about quality of artifacts, how to measure quality, how to quickly evaluate the quality of an experiment, of the artifact. And the quality here means the same as usability, how easy it is to use this artifact and how good it is. And so that usually means that artifact has good documentation if it's usable, and it means that the code is easy to run and it's easy to understand what the code does. And in some cases, respondents to our survey also noted that it's good to have artifact that is portable, so it will run on multiple platforms. So this is really challenging for authors, though, to produce those artifacts of high quality, because maybe no one will use your artifact. Maybe you publish a paper and you publish an artifact and you put in a lot of effort, but no one uses it, so it's wasted effort. There's also no funding today that covers specifically artifact preparation and release. So it's an extra work that you do for, without any pay. It has low impact on promotion or graduation progress or reputation of a researcher in many cases. And once you release your artifact and let's say the student graduates, there is no maintenance being done on that artifact because the student has moved on, and the advisor often doesn't have enough expertise to maintain that artifact. So one actionable item that came from this discussion was that students need to be taught how to produce and package artifacts so that they are easily usable. One way would be to package them as Docker images or VM images, to document those artifacts properly and to produce test cases so that one can easily, once they run the artifact, use these test cases to understand that it's running properly. Looking into evaluation of artifacts, the participants noted that there was lots of value for science, for authors of the artifacts, for the venues that run the evaluation, and for use of artifacts in education. However, authors and evaluators don't get so much out of this artifact evaluation. So authors may feel that their artifact is not ready, and therefore they might feel that, oh, well, I can't share it yet. It's really research-grade code. It's so messy. I'm going to clean it. I'm going to share it later, and then that later never happens. The evaluators get some reward from evaluation, but it's rather small. So evaluators are usually students, and their name gets listed somewhere on the conference webpage as the participant in the evaluation committee. But this does not carry the same weight for their reputation. It does not help their reputation as much as being on, say, program committee of the conference. So therefore, it's hard to recruit skilled evaluators. The main hurdle for evaluation noted by participants in our workshop that were on the evaluation, they were actually running the evaluation committees, was the lack of special hardware and the lack of access to data sets that were needed to evaluate certain artifacts. So if the research was done using special hardware in one's lab or a private data set, then the evaluator would need access to that. And it was really hard to get that access, especially remotely. So sometimes artifacts could not be evaluated based on that. There was a lot of discussion around, should artifacts be required for publication or should they just be encouraged? And right now, they are mostly just encouraged in a lot of places, and it has an impact. We've seen more and more sharing of artifacts because these venues encourage artifact submission and evaluation. But if they were required, we really need to think, when would we require them? at submission time or at final version, and whether once artifacts are submitted, should they be evaluated? Who will guarantee that they will be evaluated on time? What happens if they don't pass that evaluation, but the paper is really solid? So there are a lot of questions there that we don't yet know how to answer. And then looking at the next steps for the community, some really good actionable items emerged. One was around standardization. We need to standardize artifact packaging. We need to standardize what does it mean to have high quality artifact. How could we measure it? What are the requirements for that? And then we need to build tutorials and guidelines that help people in the community learn how to produce artifacts that meet those standards, and how to share more than just code and data sets, how to share their whole research process. We need some incentives for authors and evaluators. That's the second actionable item. So in the community, we need to recognize sharing of artifacts. We need venues where you can publish just artifacts. You don't have to have a paper, but you can publish your data set or you can publish your code. And we need to build the culture of sharing and reuse, which obviously will take time to build. But venues are starting to have these artifact evaluation committees and to encourage sharing and to encourage reuse. So hopefully we'll get there. It just takes time. And the funding agencies could provide funding for artifacts. In my view, this should not be competitive funding. It should not be something where you write a 15-page proposal and have 10 to 15% chance of getting funded. It should be more something like supplement. Like today we have supplements for undergraduate research. We could have supplements for releasing, packaging and releasing an artifact. So if you have a current funded project, you could apply for this supplement. It's a little bit of money to fund the student for a few months to package and produce this high quality artifact and then share it. And so to summarize our findings around artifacts, were that we need high quality artifacts that are also easy to find. And to get there, we need to educate and reward students to produce the artifacts. We need to fund PIs to produce these artifacts. We need to reward evaluators that work to evaluate and identify quality artifacts. And then we need to create research infrastructure that really helps authors, helps researchers to package and share and reuse artifacts. And the community can help here by building the culture of sharing and reuse. So to conclude, we need today more sophisticated cybersecurity and privacy research products that would be then deployed and be impactful in the real life and not just die on paper in publication. And so this rests on providing representative, easy-to-use experimental infrastructure and easy ways to share and reuse artifacts, because both of these encourage this vertical research development and more sophisticated research. Our workshops produced a set of specific recommendations. Some were for community building, around building the culture around sharing and reuse and experimentation. Some were for funding agencies, some were for artifact authors and evaluators. And obviously, because there are so many stakeholders, it will take a concerted effort of many to make progress, because we need materials to teach students how to do this. We need venues to require artifacts and reviewers to require comparison with related work. We need funding agencies to provide funding supplements. We need, better equipped test beds and test beds that have support for the whole experiment life cycle. So my hope is that we can actually get there, but it will take time and it will take effort of the entire community. So thank you for this. Any questions for me, please go ahead.
I'm Yoshi from UC Irvine. When I was listening to your talk, I just remembered that one of my previous roommates he was working in machine learning field. And in machine learning, it's very common to have this open reproducibility challenge where like they would have the community, not just like the artifact evaluators, but they would like have a bunch of volunteers from the community to test whether the results that are reported in a paper is actually correct or not. Do you see a similar kind of thing happening in the cybersecurity space as well?
Yes, I've observed that too, and many others, that machine learning really has this process very well thought through and set up. I would venture to say that it's maybe a little easier for machine learning community to do that because the research they are doing is mostly requires computational resources. So it is, and there are really good packages that everyone's using in Python to process the data. And so it's maybe a little easier to produce something that someone else can then, run and verify your results. Then when you do system security research, where you are, building maybe a certain kernel modules, and you're doing something that is really very tied to the particular system. Maybe you're using multiple machines, you're setting up the whole network and traffic generation, and then it becomes a little messier. But I think we can get there. We just need to find a way to package experiments that are more complex than just computation.
Hi, this is Filippo from the poll. So we talk about, that was an excellent talk, by the way. We talk about artifact sharing, but throughout your talk, I'm thinking about we have data sets and artifacts that are attacks that could lead in situations where someone could try to use them and they reinvent a further attack or apply it to propagate an attack. What is your opinion on brokered sharing or levels of clearance, for lack of a better word, in artifacts? So there could be an artifact that everyone can use it, but there could be an artifact where it will require mutual agreement between or a third party to broker and monitor, so that artifact is not misused or have. What is your opinion in that kind of like a structure?
Yeah, so excellent question. Thank you for that. So I'm also on a project called ClassNet that shares certain data sets that face the similar type of question. Some data sets are non-sensitive and you can just share them with anyone, and others are sensitive and you really want to vet who has access to them. And so, yes, brokered sharing is a good answer to that question. This is exactly what we do on this project, and this is exactly what Impact Project did. The Impact Project was funded by DHS some time ago to share data sets in networking and cybersecurity. And pretty much the idea is that you have these levels of access. So if the data set is very sensitive, then it can be accessed only on your machine. So you have really, strict requirements about who can access it. And if it's not very sensitive, then anyone can request it and download it.
Yeah, it certainly adds additional levels of complexity. And it can also be used not just for attack type data, but if you have some kind of proprietary or other types of restricted data. So it definitely accommodates a lot of these situations.
Yeah, but I'll say that, private data sets, for example, let's say you have a collaboration with an industry partner and they have really rich data set that is really good for studying, let's say, data exfiltration attacks. And so it's an ideal data set for that purpose. But unfortunately, probably that cannot be shared with anyone because your partner is just comfortable sharing with you. So it's a double-edged sword, let's say. It's a really good data set to study that, but it does not lead to reproducible research.
Hi, Leon from TU Darmstadt here. I have a question. Do you think it will be viable in the future to publish papers at top conferences with the sole contribution of a new data set, a new test bed, something like that, without a new contribution in an IDS or new attack or something on these?
That rather depends. I'm not optimistic in that regard. I think what we need is a venue that is specially built for artifact publication, and then that venue could over time grow to be a top-tier venue. But I don't see that research conferences would open up to publication of just artifacts.
One thing that occurs to me is maybe an intermediate step would be to do a workshop, not much unlike what we're doing here with Laser, where we build on artifacts at co-located conferences. I'll also point out that couple things. One, AXAC, which was the first of the cybersecurity conferences to have an artifact initiative starting back in 2017. Last year in 2022, they started an artifact competition where artifacts from any of the different venues could be submitted and would receive an award for best. They'd be reviewed and there'd be an award for the best artifact. I'll also mention, this is news, Jelena and Laura, for you. There was discussion yesterday at NDSS steering about initiating an artifact evaluation process as part of the conference moving forward. And it seemed there wasn't time for a lot of discussion, but there seemed to be a lot of nods, including from Matthias Payer and Christina Popper, who are going to be the program chairs going forward. They'll need to get involved. They'll need to get artifact evaluation chairs involved. And also, it looks like S&P is now looking into doing some kind of artifact initiative. I spoke with Patrick Traynor, who was here, and he's the S&P program chair this year, and he says that they're starting to have that discussion. So we may be rapidly approaching the point where all four of the big four and AXAC, along with PETS and others, are doing artifact initiatives.
Yeah, so that's wonderful to hear.
Yep. Okay, I think we are at break time. I don't see anyone else.
Before you go, I'm just going to share the report because I finally did find how
great.
to
Thank
get
you.
there. So what the results show from this group is that people look for research artifacts for most papers they publish. So that was the most frequent response. And then most frequent response about usability is I always look, but I rarely find something I can reuse. And then the next is I always look and I always find something to reuse. So these are two opposite answers. So I'm guessing it's probably dependent on the type of research. So again, if you're doing something with machine learning or something else where computational artifacts are enough, then it might be easier to find than if you're doing, for example, systems security. And then what would help you share more is more time or more students. So this obviously then leads to the issue we discussed around funding, because funding would help here to have more students that would help with the sharing. What would help you reuse more is better ability to find relevant artifacts and better quality of artifacts that are easier to reuse. So that
looks like we have at least one respondent who is sharing anything and everything they produce because they don't need anything to help.
Okay, thank you, everyone.